The day was dying in a wash of copper and dust. In the town of Redemption, the sun didn't set. It bled out across the horizon, staining the hard-packed earth a tired, angry red. A dry wind, born somewhere in the vast, unforgiving plains, skittered down the single main street. It carried the scent of sun-baked wood, horse sweat, and the faint, sour smell of stale beer leaking from the swinging doors of the saloon. Those doors creaked on their leather hinges, a lonely, rhythmic complaint against the silence that was always waiting to reclaim the town. Dust, fine as milled flour, coated everything, the warped planks of the boardwalk, the cloudy glass of the general store, the brims of hats pulled low over weary eyes. It was a patient, persistent grit that worked its way into the folds of a person's clothes and the lines around their mouth, a constant reminder of where they were, a place clinging to the edge of the map, held down by little more than stubbornness and gravity. Through this haze of fading light and swirling dust, a woman moved. Her name was Eliza. She progressed not like a person walking, but like one assembling the act of it, piece by painful piece. One hand, knuckles bone white, gripped the worn handle of a wooden crutch. Its tip dug a small, apologetic hole in the street with every lurching step. Her dress, a calico of a color long since surrendered to sun and dirt, was torn near the hem, catching on the rough ground. There was a dark, ugly split on her lower lip, still glistening faintly, a fresh punctuation mark on a face already etched with old sorrows. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the few feet of ground before her, as if she were a guest in the world and each step required a silent, desperate permission she was not sure she would be granted. Her slow, halting passage was an event. From the shadowed porch of the Mercantile, women in bonnets stopped their rocking chairs. Their whispers were as dry and brittle as autumn leaves. "There she goes," one murmured, not bothering to lower her voice. "The widow Miller, living on the church's charity." Another sniffed, a sound of pure disdain. "Charity's one thing, bad luck's another. Nothing but trouble since her husband went and got himself shot over a card game." The words were meant to be heard. Small, sharp stones thrown at her back. Outside the saloon, a cluster of men leaned against the hitching post. They watched her with a different kind of attention, a lazy, cruel curiosity. They saw not a person, but a spectacle, a broken thing. They saw the limp, the tattered dress, the ghost of a woman who had once been whole. Their comments were lower, rougher, punctuated by laughter that held no joy. They saw weakness, and in a place like this, weakness was a sin. Leaning against the railing of the blacksmith's porch, slightly apart from the others, was Cole Reyes. He wasn't watching her with the same predatory amusement. He wasn't watching her at all. Not really. His gaze was fixed on the far-off mesas, his eyes as dark and unreadable as a deep well. He was a tall man, built with the spare, hard-muscled frame of someone who worked from sunup to sundown. He wore his silence like a shield. The town had its own story about him, a story it whispered when he wasn't near. They said he had a temper that ran hotter and faster than a brush fire, that he'd been that way ever since his younger brother, Jacob, had bled out in this very street a year prior, the result of a stupid argument and a faster gun. They said Cole had arrived too late to help, and the part of him that knew how to be gentle had died right there with his brother. Now, he just existed, a quiet, brooding presence that the townsfolk knew better than to provoke. He ran his small ranch alone, spoke when he had to, and kept the world at arm's length. Eliza's painful journey brought her near the saloon. The sliver of shade offered by its overhang was a small mercy, a brief reprieve from the relentless sun. She paused, leaning heavily on her crutch, her breath coming in shallow, dusty rasps. She just wanted a moment, a single moment to gather herself before continuing on to the small room behind the church she was allowed to occupy. One of the men pushed himself off the post, a smirk playing on his lips. "Looking for something, widow," he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry across the street. Eliza didn't look at him. She stared at the sliver of shade as if it were a promised land. "Just some shadow," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Shadows are for folks who belong somewhere. You're more like a ghost yourself. His companions laughed along with him. Another one, emboldened, shifted the cut of tobacco in his cheek and spat a thick, brown stream into the dust, just inches from the hem of her dress. It was a gesture of profound contempt, a dismissal of her very existence. The act, so small and so vile, seemed to shatter the last of her composure. Her focus broke, the crutch, its base finding no purchase in the loose, sullied dirt, slid sideways. A small, choked sound escaped her throat as her balance gave way. She didn't fall so much as crumple, her bad leg giving out from under her, sending her down to her knees in a cloud of her own humiliation. The crutch clattered onto the street beside her. The world went quiet for a beat, the town holding its breath to watch the final, pathetic act of her day. From the blacksmith's porch, Cole Reyes let out a breath. It was a sharp, ragged sound, as if he'd been holding it in all this time. He didn't look at the men who jeered. His dark eyes were fixed on the small, defeated shape of the woman kneeling in the dirt. The stillness that had defined him broke. He pushed himself off the railing, the wood groaning in protest. He took the 2 steps down to the street level, his boots landing with quiet thuds that seemed to silence the last of the snickering. He walked over to her, his shadow falling over her long before he arrived. He stopped in front of her. For a long moment, he just stood there, a dark and silent mountain. Eliza didn't look up. She was staring at the spittle in the dust, her shame a physical weight pinning her to the ground. Then he extended his hand. It was a large, calloused hand, stained with grease and earth, and it trembled. It was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, but it was there, the hesitation of a man for whom a simple act of compassion was a foreign, forgotten language. It was the hand of a man reaching for something he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch, or even wanted to. He said nothing. He simply held it there, palm up, an offering in the suffocating silence. Slowly, as if waking from a trance, Eliza raised her head. She saw the worn boots, the dusty trousers, and then the outstretched hand. Her eyes followed the line of his arm up to his face. She saw the hard line of his jaw, the eyes that gave nothing away, and the profound, aching awkwardness of his gesture. She hesitated, her own fear and pride warring within her. Accepting help was an admission of defeat, but she was already defeated. With a shaking hand of her own, she placed it in his. His grip was firm, surprisingly gentle. He pulled her to her feet with an economy of motion, his strength making it seem effortless. He didn't let go until she was steady, her weight resting on her good leg. He bent down, picked up her crutch, and handed it to her. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. In his, she saw no pity, which was a mercy in itself. She saw something else, something shuddered and deep, a shared understanding of pain that needed no words. He turned his back on the silent, watching men. He looked down the street, toward the open prairie that began where the town gave up. "Follow me," he said. The words were not a request. They were a simple, quiet command, rough around the edges but clear in their intent. Eliza looked back for a moment at the town, at the hostile faces now painted with confusion. She looked at the door of the church, her supposed sanctuary. Then she looked at the back of the stranger, this grim, silent man who had offered a trembling hand when the world had offered only scorn. Without another word, she adjusted her crutch and took the first step to follow him. They walked out of redemption as the last of the sun's fire sank below the earth, leaving the sky bruised and purple. They moved in a shared, heavy silence. 2 solitary figures against the immense, darkening landscape. Above them, high in the twilight air, a lone hawk circled, its wings spread wide, its shadow, vast and fleeting, swept across the dry grass before them. a dark, silent omen passing over the two wounded souls walking away from the town that had cast them out. The walk was a silent pilgrimage away from the world. Cole set a pace that was slow enough for her to manage, but unhalting, as if the thought of stopping or looking back was a weakness he could not afford. The dust of the main street gave way to the tougher, wilder earth of the prairie. Sparse grasses, bleached the color of old bone, crunched under his boots and whispered against the ragged hem of her dress. The air grew cooler as the last warmth of the day was drawn up into the vast, indifferent sky. Eliza focused on the rhythm, the solid, even tread of Cole's boots ahead of her, and the uneven scrape and thump of her own progress. Her body was a chorus of aches. The muscles in her good legs screamed from overuse. Her arms trembled from the strain of the crutch, and the cut on her lip throbbed with a slow, insistent beat. She tasted blood and dust. She did not ask where they were going. The question seemed impossibly large, and she had no right to ask it. He was a direction, and for now, that was more than she'd had all day. After what felt like an eternity measured in heartbeats and painful steps, a shape resolved itself in the deep twilight. It was a homestead, though that word implied a level of care and life that this place seemed to have forgotten. A split-rail fence, meant to define a boundary between the tamed and the wild, had given up the fight. Several posts leaned at drunken angles, their rails splintered and lying half-swallowed by the encroaching grass. A stone well stood near the main cabin, but its wooden bucket lay on its side, cracked and dry, and a deep look inside would have revealed nothing but shadows and cracked earth. The house itself was a simple, boxy structure made of rough-hewn timber that the sun and wind had scoured to a pale, silvery gray. It looked less like a home and more like a scar on the land, something that had endured rather than lived. Neglect hung over the place like a shroud, a visible extension of the silence that enveloped the man who led her there. Cole didn't lead her to the house. He veered toward a smaller, darker structure set off to the side the barn. Its great doors hung slightly askew on their iron hinges. He pushed one open, the groaning complaint of the wood echoing in the still air. The smell that rolled out was thick and honest dry hay, the warmth of animals, earth, and old wood. It was a smell of life, however humble. He stepped inside and gestured with his chin toward a corner where the hay was piled thickest. "Tonight, you stay here," he said. The words were flat, without welcome or condescension. They were a statement of fact. He walked over to a pump in the corner and worked the handle until a stream of rusty water gave way to a clearer, colder flow. Filling a wooden bucket, he set it on the ground near the pile of hay. "That bay mare in the far stall," he added, his voice low as he pointed to a dark shape shifting in a stall. "She kicks. Stay clear of her." And that was all. He turned and left, pulling the heavy barn door mostly shut behind him, leaving a wide enough gap for the last of the day's light to filter through. He did not ask her name. He did not ask how she came to be in the street, or where she had been before. The emptiness of his questions was, in its own way, a kindness. He had asked nothing of her, not even her story. Eliza stood for a long moment, the silence of the barn settling around her. It was a different kind of silence than the one in town. This was a living quiet, filled with the soft rustle of hay and the occasional stamp of a hoof. She hobbled over to the bucket of water. Kneeling was an agony, but she managed it. Propping her crutch against the wall, she plunged her hands into the water, the shock of the cold a welcome jolt. She cupped it and brought it to her face, washing away the grime of the street, the spittle, the tears she hadn't allowed to fall. She rinsed the cut on her lip, hissing as the cold water found the raw flesh. She looked down into the bucket. The water stilled, and in its dark, wavering surface, she saw a stranger, a distorted reflection of a woman with haunted eyes, a swollen lip, and hair matted with dust. The last of the light caught on the side of her face, illuminating the faint, yellowish tint of an old bruise on her cheekbone. As she pulled back the sleeve of her dress to wash her arm, darker, Angrier marks emerged on her skin, deep purple smudges that mapped a history of rough hands and careless cruelty. She stared at them, not with surprise, but with a dull, weary recognition. They were a part of her, like her own shadow. She washed the skin gently, as if tending to someone else's wounds. Each stroke was an attempt to cleanse more than just the dirt. It was an effort to wash away the whispers, the stares, the suffocating weight of being a burden. But the bruises remained, stubborn and deep, a truth the water could not erase. As she finished, a sound started up from outside, the rhythmic, solid thud of a hammer striking wood. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It was a steady, purposeful sound. It was followed by the grating rasp of a saw cutting through a plank. Cole was working. In the near darkness, he was mending one of the broken fence rails. The sounds were a strange comfort. They were not the sounds of anger or idleness. They were the sounds of repair, of something being put right. It was a kind of peace, she thought, though a strained and fragile one, like a thread stretched taut. It was the peace of two strangers occupying the same small space of earth, bound for a short time by a single, unspoken act, each respecting the other's silence as if it were a physical wall between them. The hammering continued, a lonely heartbeat in the immense quiet of the coming night. Darkness fell completely, swallowing the landscape and leaving only the brilliant, cold pinpricks of the stars. The world shrank to the size of the barn, and Eliza's fear, a familiar companion, began to creep in from the edges of the shadows. Night was when the ghosts came out, the ghost of her husband, the ghost of the woman she used to be, the ghost of a future she had lost. She pulled her thin dress tighter around her, the hay a poor defense against the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She heard his footsteps approaching, slow and heavy. They stopped outside the barn door. He didn't enter. Instead, he pushed the door open a little wider. In one hand, he carried a thick wool blanket, folded neatly. In the other, a lit kerosene lantern, its glass chimney clean, its flame a steady, golden tear against the blackness. The light spilled into the barn, chasing the deepest shadows back into their corners. It illuminated the motes of dust dancing in the air, turning them into a swirl of tiny, golden stars. He set the blanket down just inside the doorway, then turned and hung the lantern from a hook on the porch post of the main cabin, just outside the barn. The light it cast was not large, but it was solid. It pushed back the oppressive, absolute dark of the prairie, creating a small, safe circle of visibility. It was a fixed point, a steady glow in the overwhelming emptiness. It felt like a silent promise, though of what she could not say. He stood there for a moment, his back to her, looking out into the night. She thought he would leave again, that his task was done, but then he spoke, his voice quiet, rough, and aimed at the darkness in front of him, not at her. "Because no one helped my brother that day," he said. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. It wasn't an explanation meant to comfort her. It was a confession, a shard of his own brokenness offered up into the night. It explained everything. The trembling hand, the gruff, minimal kindness. This wasn't about her. It was about a ghost of his own, a debt he was trying to pay to a memory. He had not saved a woman from the street. He was trying to save himself from a moment that was already gone. He turned and walked back into his silent house, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Eliza pulled the blanket toward her. It was heavy and smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the rough wool a solid, comforting weight. She lay down in the pile of hay, her body finally surrendering to its bone-deep exhaustion. Through the gap in the barn doors, she could see the lantern. It burned with a clean, unwavering light, a small, defiant star holding its own against the immense, crushing darkness of the prairie night. It stood watch. For the first time in more nights than she could count, Eliza closed her eyes and was not afraid of the dark. The world was still a cruel and dangerous place. Her future was a blank, terrifying page. But tonight, for just this one night, she was not alone in the blackness. A small, steady light was keeping vigil. Dawn did not arrive. It seeped. It came as a slow, watery gray light that leaked through the warped planks of the barn wall, striping the hay-strewn floor with pale, ghostly lines. Outside, the kerosene lantern still burned on its hook, its flame now a weak, fluttering thing against the growing day, a lonely sentinel that had completed its watch. The air was cool and carried the clean, damp scent of dew on dry earth. It was a morning unburdened by the heat and dust that would inevitably come, a brief, quiet moment of purity. Eliza woke slowly, her body a map of stiff muscles and deep aches. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The scent of hay and the unfamiliar pattern of light were disorienting. Then the memory of the previous day returned: the street, the spittle in the dust, the silent man. She sat up, pulling the heavy wool blanket around her shoulders. The barn was quiet, except for the soft chewing of the horses and the rustle of a mouse in the rafters. The world felt held in a delicate, fragile truce. Looking through the gap in the doors, she could see him. Cole was already working. He stood by the broken section of fence, his back to her. The sleeves of his worn flannel shirt were rolled up past his elbows, revealing forearms that were tanned a deep, dark brown from years under the sun. He moved with a steady, practiced rhythm, his actions spare and efficient. There was no wasted motion. He'd pry an old, splintered rail loose, measure a new plank of cedar he'd sawn, and hammer it into place with 3 solid, ringing blows. The sound was clean and sharp in the cool air, a declaration of purpose. He was a man who communicated with his hands, with the act of mending what was broken. Watching him, Eliza felt a pang of something she couldn't name. It was the feeling of being utterly useless, a piece of driftwood washed up on the shore of this man's solitary life. He had given her shelter, a blanket, and a guarded light in the darkness. She had given him nothing but the weight of her presence. The need to do something, anything, became a physical ache inside her. She couldn't fix a fence or break a horse, but she could make herself useful. She could try to pay a small portion of a debt he had never asked her to incur. Carefully, using her crutch, she pushed herself to her feet. Her leg was stiff, but the pain had subsided to a dull, manageable throb. She moved out of the barn and into the yard, her steps hesitant on the damp ground. He heard her approach and stopped his hammering. Turning his head, his face was unreadable in the morning light, his expression guarded. He watched her limp toward him, his dark eyes missing nothing. She stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude on his space. "Mr. Reyes," she began, her voice still rough from sleep. He just looked at her, waiting. I was wondering," she faltered, suddenly unsure of herself, "if I might clean up the kitchen a little to earn my keep." His eyes narrowed slightly. He turned fully to face her, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. He looked from her earnest, nervous face to the silent, gray house. "You don't owe me anything," he said. The words were clipped, almost harsh. It felt like a dismissal, a wall being raised between them. Eliza's shoulders slumped. Of course, he wanted nothing from her. He wanted her to be invisible, a temporary problem he could solve and then forget. "I see," she whispered, turning to go back to the barn. "I didn't say you couldn't," he added, his voice rougher than before. She stopped, turning back to look at him. He had already turned away, picking up his hammer as if the conversation were finished, as if those few words had cost him more effort than driving a dozen nails. He wasn't giving her permission. He was simply not forbidding it. For Eliza, it was enough. It was a space, however small, that she could occupy with purpose. She made her way to the house. The front door opened into the main room, which served as a kitchen and living space. It was the room of a man living alone, a man who had stopped seeing his surroundings. A fine layer of dust covered everything. On a small, sturdy table in the center of the room sat a dented tin plate with the remains of last night's meal, a half-empty cup of cold coffee beside it. The hearth was filled with old, gray ash and charred logs. A cold and desolate heart in the center of the home, a single cast-iron pot, its side dented inward, sat on the floor near the fireplace. The air was stale, thick with the ghosts of old meals and solitude. Yet, amid the neglect, there were signs of another life. On a small shelf, a stack of books leaned against each other, their spines faded, and on the table, next to the dirty plate, lay a Bible. It was not a new, pristine book from a church pew. Its leather cover was worn smooth at the corners, the pages softened and frayed from countless turnings. It was an object that had been held, read, and perhaps even wept over. It spoke of a time when this house might have known a different kind of silence, a different kind of order. Eliza saw not a mess, but a task, a tangible problem she could solve. It was a relief. Her own life was a chaotic tangle of grief, injury, and uncertainty. A wreck she had no idea how to salvage. But this room, this mess, had boundaries. It had a beginning and an end. She started with the hearth. She found a small shovel and a bucket and began scooping out the cold ashes. The work was slow and awkward with her injury, but she moved with a quiet determination. Each shovelful felt like clearing away something old and dead. She carried the bucket outside and emptied the ashes into the wind, watching them dissipate into a gray cloud, gone. Next, she tackled the dishes. She found a bar of harsh lye soap and a rough cloth, pumping water at the sink inside. She scrubbed the tin plate until it shone. She washed the dented pot, her hands working their way into every corner, removing the last traces of old food. As she worked, she fell into a rhythm. The scrape of the cloth, the slosh of the water, the clink of the plate as she set it on a shelf to dry. Each small sound was a counterpoint to the silence that had filled her life for so long. Each clean object was a small victory, a reclamation of order. This was work she understood. It was a language her body knew. With each methodical movement, she felt as if she were not just cleaning a room, but carefully, painstakingly, reassembling the fractured pieces of her own heart. She swept the floor, her crutch propped against the table. The broom whispered across the wooden planks, gathering dust bunnies and stray bits of dried mud into a small pile. She wiped down the table, her cloth moving in slow, circular motions, revealing the rich grain of the wood beneath the grime. She cleaned the single window until the morning light, which had been a dull, filtered gray, now streamed in, bright and clear, illuminating the newly cleaned space. The hours passed. Outside, the steady rhythm of Cole's hammer continued, a distant, percussive accompaniment to her own quiet work. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its light warming the wooden floorboards. The kitchen was transformed. It was still a simple, rustic room, a room of profound loneliness, but it was no longer neglected. It was clean. It breathed. The air smelled of soap and damp wood instead of stale air and dust. She had not added anything to the room, but by taking away the dirt and disorder, she had allowed it to become itself again. By midday, she was finished. She stood in the middle of the room, leaning on her crutch, her body aching with a good, clean exhaustion. She looked at the gleaming floor, the tidy shelves, the Bible now sitting alone in the center of the clean table. A quiet testament, a sense of peace, fragile but real, settled over her. She heard his boots on the porch. The sound was heavy, tired. He was coming in for his midday meal. Her heart began to beat a little faster. What would he say? Would he be angry at her for taking such a liberty? Would he ignore it completely? The door swung open, and Cole stepped inside, bringing the bright, harsh sunlight in with him. He stopped abruptly, just inside the doorway, as if he had walked into the wrong house. His eyes, accustomed to the dim clutter, blinked against the clean brightness. He stood frozen, his gaze sweeping over the room. He saw the empty hearth, the gleaming pot on the shelf, the table scrubbed clean, the floorboards glowing in a patch of sunlight. He saw the order, the care, the sheer, unambiguous cleanliness of it all. The silence in the room was absolute, thick with the unspoken. He looked like a man who had come home to find that a stranger had rearranged his soul. His eyes finally settled on her, standing by the table. His expression was a mixture of confusion and something else she couldn't decipher. It wasn't anger, it was something closer to shock. "I didn't tell you to do that," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact, a man trying to make sense of something that had happened outside of his control. Eliza met his gaze. Her fear had evaporated, replaced by a quiet sense of rightness. She had done this for herself as much as for him. "You didn't tell me to breathe either," she replied. Her voice was soft, but the words were steady. Without apology, it was the simplest truth. An act of living required no permission. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. The air between them felt charged, a live wire. She saw a muscle twitch in his jaw, and then something extraordinary happened. The hard, stern line of his mouth softened. The corners of his lips quirked. Just for a second, a fractional, involuntary movement. It was the ghost of a smile, a shadow of an expression that had not seen the light of day for a very long time. It was not a smile of humor or of joy. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated surprise. It was the reluctant blooming of a crack in a stone facade, and it vanished as quickly as it appeared. But Eliza had seen it. He broke eye contact, looking down at the clean floor as if it held the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. He took off his hat, running a hand through his dusty hair. The small, aborted smile was gone, but the harshness in his face had lessened, replaced by a deep and profound weariness. He had walked into his house, and for the first time in a long time, it felt a little less like a tomb. The ghost of a smile vanished, but it left an echo in the room. The air, once tight with suspicion and awkwardness, had loosened, allowing space to breathe. Cole stood in the doorway, a large, solid man momentarily adrift in his own home. He looked at the clean floor, then at Eliza, and then back at the floor, as if trying to reconcile two different versions of his life. The silence stretched, no longer hostile, but expectant. Finally, he seemed to land on the most solid and undeniable fact in the world. He lifted his gaze to meet hers. "Hungry?" he asked. The word was simple, stripped of all artifice. It wasn't a question about her feelings or her future. It was a question about the now, about a basic, physical need. The question sent a strange, conflicting current through Eliza. There was the hot flush of shame, the stark acknowledgement of her dependence. She was a stray, taking up space, and now her hunger was a problem to be solved. But beneath the shame was a deeper, warmer current of gratitude. He had seen her, not as a symbol of his past failure, not as a piece of troublesome baggage, but as a person with a body that required sustenance. He had acknowledged her need. "Yes," she answered, her voice small but clear. Cole gave a single, decisive nod. He stepped fully into the room, his presence seeming to fill the newly ordered space. He walked past her to the dry sink, picked up the bucket, and went outside to the pump. She heard the rhythmic squeak and clank of the handle, then the splash of water filling the bucket. He returned, setting the heavy bucket on the floor. He looked at the clean, cold stove, then at her. "Then cook," he said. It was not a command. It was a transfer of responsibility. It was a key to a small corner of his world. "You are hungry. Here is the means. Feed yourself, and by extension, feed me." It was a challenge and an invitation all at once, a test cloaked in practicality. For a woman who had been defined by what she lacked: a husband, a home, a whole leg, a good name, the directive to create something. Even a simple meal was terrifying and thrilling. A wave of panic washed over her. Cook in this strange kitchen, on that formidable iron stove. For this silent, watchful man, her hands, which had been so steady while cleaning, suddenly felt clumsy and foreign. Her cooking, in her previous life, had been adequate but uninspired, the simple fare of a wife who had other, more pressing worries. Under his gaze, the task felt monumental, a trial by fire. She nodded, a jerky, uncertain movement. He accepted it without comment, pulling out one of the two chairs at the table and sitting down. He didn't watch her, not directly. Instead, he picked up the worn Bible from the center of the table and opened it to a random page, his large, calloused finger tracing a line of scripture. But she felt his presence as a physical weight, a silent observer at the edge of her vision. He was giving her space, but the space itself was a stage. Her first task was to discover what there was to cook. A search of the small pantry, little more than a few rough-hewn shelves behind a calico curtain, yielded a small sack of potatoes, half a sack of flour, a tin of coffee beans, and a canister of salt. In a cooler box near the door, she found 4 precious eggs and a slab of salt pork wrapped in butcher paper. It was the diet of a man who ate to live. Nothing more. She decided on fried potatoes and eggs. With coffee, it was the simplest of meals, yet every step felt fraught with peril. She started with the coffee, a task she thought she couldn't possibly get wrong. She found a hand grinder clamped to a shelf and poured in a measure of dark, oily beans. The grinding was hard work, her arms protesting the unfamiliar motion, but the rich, dark aroma that filled the air was a small comfort, a smell of civilization. But in her nervousness, she misjudged the amount of water in the percolator and let it sit on the stove too long. The initial fragrant scent slowly curdled, turning sharp and acrid. The smell of scorched coffee began to permeate the clean air, the first sign of her failure. Next, the potatoes. She scrubbed them clean, her hands shaking slightly. She sliced them as evenly as she could, but some pieces were thick and clumsy, others thin as paper. She rendered a few slices of the salt pork in the heavy cast-iron skillet, the fat sputtering and popping angrily. The smell of frying pork was a welcome improvement over the burned coffee, a hearty, honest scent. She added the potatoes, stirring them with a long-handled fork. This, at least, felt familiar. Finally, the eggs. The skillet was hot, perhaps too hot. The grease was shimmering. She cracked the first egg on the side of the pan. A piece of shell fell in, and she cursed herself under her breath as she tried to fish it out with the tip of the fork. She cracked the remaining 3, and they hit the sizzling fat with a violent hiss, the whites spreading and bubbling furiously. She was so focused on not breaking the yolks that she let them cook a moment too long. When she finally slid them from the pan onto the 2 tin plates, the bottoms were a lacy, browned black, while the tops were still slightly underdone, a small, culinary catastrophe. Her hands trembled as she carried the plates to the table. She felt the heat of shame rise in her cheeks. The meal was a disaster. The coffee would be bitter as gall, the eggs a burnt offering. She had been given a simple test, and she had failed it. She set one plate in front of him, then her own. She poured the coffee, its dark, murky appearance confirming her fears. She sat down, her own appetite gone, and waited for the verdict. Cole placed the Bible, still open, beside his plate. He picked up his fork and, without ceremony, broke the yolk of one of the eggs. He scooped up a portion of egg and potato and ate it. He chewed slowly, his expression unchanging. Eliza watched his throat as he swallowed. He took another bite, and another. He ate in a profound, unnerving silence, a silence broken only by the scrape of his fork against the tin plate. He did not look at her. He did not grimace or complain. He simply ate the burnt, misshapen food she had placed before him. She couldn't bear it. She stared down at her own plate, at the ruin of the eggs. and felt a familiar despair begin to settle in her chest. She had proven what the town already believed: she was useless, a burden, incapable of even the simplest task. He finished everything on his plate. He pushed it forward an inch, picked up his mug of coffee, and took a long swallow. He held it for a moment, then set the mug down with a soft thud. The silence returned, heavier than before. He looked at the plate, then finally, he looked at her. "Need salt," he said. The words were so unexpected, so breathtakingly simple, that she could only stare at him. Not, "This is burnt." Not, "The coffee is terrible." Just a single, objective, fixable flaw. It was the driest, most factual critique she had ever received. And in its blunt honesty, there was no malice. There was no judgment. It was the observation of a man who dealt in practicalities, not sentiments. A knot of tension she hadn't even realized she was holding deep inside her began to dissolve. He wasn't angry, he wasn't disappointed. He had eaten the food, and his only comment was a suggestion for improvement. A suggestion that implied there might be another attempt. "Next time," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll do better." He gave another one of his small, almost imperceptible nods. He took another drink of the bitter coffee as if it were the finest brew. "Wasn't bad," he said, the words gruff, as if admitting it cost him something. And that was it. That was the absolution. A burnt, unsalted meal was not bad. In the sparse economy of his language, it was the highest of compliments. For the first time since she had arrived in this town, a genuine, unforced smile touched Eliza's lips. It was a fragile thing, as thin and delicate as a spider's thread, but it was real. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. As if on cue, the light in the room shifted. A heavy bank of clouds, which had been gathering unseen on the horizon, finally rolled over the sun, plunging the prairie into a sudden, premature twilight. A low, distant rumble of thunder echoed from far away. A deep vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. The wind began to pick up, rattling the window pane in its frame. Cole pushed his chair back and stood up. "Storm's coming," he stated. Another simple fact. He grabbed his hat and went outside, walking toward the corral where his horses stood, their heads already turned to the wind. Eliza watched him through the window as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, kicking up little puffs of dust before turning the yard into a dark, muddy canvas. He moved with the same unhurried purpose, checking the gate on the corral, then leading the bay mare and another horse into the shelter of the barn. The rain came down harder now, a driving sheet of water that blurred the world outside. A sudden, brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the little house to its foundations. Eliza flinched violently, a choked cry escaping her lips. She wrapped her arms around herself, her body coiling in on itself as if expecting a blow. The sound was too much like a gunshot, too sudden, too final. It was the sound of a world breaking apart. The door opened, and Cole stepped back inside, bringing the smell of rain and wet earth with him. Water streamed from the brim of his hat and dripped from the shoulders of his shirt. He saw her, huddled in her chair, her face pale, her knuckles white where she gripped her own arms. He saw the terror in her eyes, a fear far greater than what a simple thunderstorm could inspire. He said nothing. He walked over to a wooden peg by the door where a heavy, dark woolen shawl was hanging. It was a woman's shawl, old and well-made. He took it down, the wool thick and soft in his hands. He walked over to her chair and, without a word, unfolded it and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The weight of it was immediate and comforting. A solid, tangible presence. It smelled of cedar and wood smoke and something else, a faint, lingering scent of lavender, a ghost of a life lived long ago. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise. He stood over her for a moment, a dripping, silent guardian against the raging storm outside. "Storms pass," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost in the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. He then turned and went about his own business, stoking the fire in the hearth to ward off the damp chill. But Eliza sat perfectly still, wrapped in the heavy, warm darkness of the shawl. The thunder still boomed outside, and the rain still lashed against the window. But the sharpest edge of her fear had been blunted. She was anchored by the weight on her shoulders, a simple, profound gesture of care that asked for nothing in return. A storm was just a storm, and like he said, it would pass. The storm raged, enclosing the small house in a world of sound and fury. Rain hammered a frantic, percussive rhythm on the shake roof, and the wind moaned around the corners of the cabin like a grieving spirit. But inside, there was a different world. The hearth, which had been a cold, dead space that morning, was now alive. A healthy fire danced and leaped, casting a warm, flickering light that pushed the darkness into soft, retreating shadows. The light caught the grain of the wood on the clean floor, the dull gleam of the tin plates on the shelf, and the weary lines on two faces. Eliza sat in the chair Cole had pulled closer to the fire, the heavy wool shawl still draped over her shoulders. Its weight was a comfort, a solid presence against the chaos outside. The warmth from the flames soaked into her bones, chasing away a chill that felt months deep. She watched the fire, mesmerized by the way the flames consumed the wood, turning solid matter into light and heat. It was a kind of magic, a quiet, steady transformation. Cole sat in the other chair, a few feet away. The space between them was filled with the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain. It was not an empty silence. It was a silence that held the weight of their shared meal, the shock of the storm, and the simple, unspoken fact of their presence in this room together. He had taken a piece of leather and a knife from a chest in the corner and was methodically mending a piece of tack, his hands moving with a slow, ingrained competence. His focus was on his work, but Eliza knew he was aware of her, just as she was aware of him. They were two solitary islands, suddenly and unexpectedly within sight of each other. He finished a stitch, pulling the waxed thread tight with a soft grunt of effort. He didn't look up from his work when he spoke, his voice a low counterpoint to the sounds of the storm. "You walk like every step is a prayer." The observation was so sudden, so intimate, that it startled her. She had grown accustomed to people watching her walk, but their stares were always clinical, critical, or pitying. They saw the mechanics of her injury, the limp, the crutch, the struggle. They saw the brokenness, but he had seen something else. He had seen the intention behind the movement, the sheer force of will it required. She turned her gaze from the fire to the glowing embers that had fallen onto the hearthstones. They pulsed with a deep, red life, fading and brightening with each breath of air from the flue. "Sometimes it is," she answered, her voice quiet. "A prayer to not fall, a prayer to be invisible, a prayer for the ground to hold steady beneath her." She didn't need to explain. The simple honesty of her reply was enough. He was silent for a long time after that, the only sounds the scrape of his awl against the leather and the hiss of a wet log in the fire. The shadows on the wall danced and swayed, growing and shrinking with the fire's pulse. Eliza felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Here, in this small, warm room, cocooned by the storm, she was not the town widow, not a burden, not a cripple. She was just a woman, sitting by a fire. Cole set his work down on the floor beside him. He flexed his large, stiff fingers and stared into the flames, his face a mask of light and shadow. The firelight carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He finally turned his head and looked at her, his gaze direct and unsettling. "How long you figure on staying?" The question was the one she had been dreading, the one that had been hovering in the air since she'd first followed him out of town. It was a practical question, a necessary one. A storm could provide temporary shelter, but morning always came, her fragile peace shattered. She was a stray after all, and he was simply wondering how long he would have to leave the door open. She felt the familiar, cold twist of anxiety in her stomach. She looked down at her hands, clasped in her lap. What could she say? She had nowhere to go, no family to take her in. The charity of the church in Redemption had worn thin, reduced to a cold cot and colder stairs. To be sent away from here was to be sent back to that, or worse. "Until you tell me to go," she said. The words were the purest, most vulnerable truth she possessed. She offered them up to him, her entire uncertain future placed squarely in his hands. It was a complete surrender of will, the only thing she had left to give. Cole's gaze didn't waver. He seemed to be weighing her words, holding them up to the light to inspect their texture and heft. He didn't look pleased or burdened. He simply looked. His eyes flickered for a moment to the corner near the door. She followed his gaze. Hanging from a wooden peg was her coat, a large, shapeless garment of dark, heavy wool. It was a man's coat, her late husband's, the only one she owned. It was still damp from their walk, and she had hung it as close to the fire as she dared, hoping it would be dry by morning. It looked pathetic and out of place in his home, another piece of her ragged life intruding into his. He looked at the coat, then back at her, and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned his attention back to the fire, and the conversation was over. He had not told her to go, for now. That was a kind of answer. The storm eventually wore itself out. The rain softened to a gentle patter and then stopped altogether. The wind died down, leaving behind a profound, dripping silence. Exhaustion finally claimed Eliza, and Cole pointed her toward a small, Spartan room off the main one, a room that held a narrow bed with a patched quilt. It was Jacob's room. He didn't say it, but she knew. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the scent of cedar and lavender from the shawl still clinging to her. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The sun shone with a brilliant, hard-edged clarity, and every blade of grass, every stone in the yard, glistened with the leftover raindrops. The air was fresh and cool. It felt like a new beginning. Eliza was awake early, her ingrained habits of a life of service pulling her from bed. She moved quietly in the kitchen, rebuilding the fire, putting the coffee on to boil less this time, watching it carefully. She felt a sense of purpose, a quiet satisfaction in the simple, domestic rhythm. The sound came from a distance at first, a rumbling of wheels and the jingle of harnesses. It grew steadily louder. It was the weekly supply wagon from the next county over, the town's main link to the outside world, making its slow journey into Redemption. The track it used ran not 100 yards from Cole's fence line. Cole came into the kitchen from outside, his face grim. He had heard it too. He poured himself a mug of the coffee she had made, his movements stiff. They both stood by the window, not looking at each other, and watched as the wagon drew near. It was driven by a man named Silas, a man with a face like a closed fist, and eyes that missed nothing, as the wagon drew parallel to the house. Silas slowed his team of mules. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the small homestead. He saw Cole's horse in the corral. He saw the newly mended fence. He saw the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. And then his eyes fixed on the house itself, a hard, penetrating stare. It felt as if he were trying to see through the very walls, to peel back the timber and peer into the secrets within. He saw Cole standing in the window, and his eyes narrowed with a mean, calculating curiosity. He lingered for a moment too long, his stare a physical intrusion, before he finally clucked to his mules and rumbled on toward town. He had seen enough. The story was already writing itself in his head. Neither Cole nor Eliza spoke. They didn't have to. They both knew what that look meant. In a town like Redemption, a stray woman in a lone man's house was not a story of rescue. It was a story of scandal. Silas was the town crier, and he had just been handed his news for the week. By evening, the poison had seeped back from the town. It didn't arrive with a shout. but with the quiet, suffocating certainty of gossip. Cole had ridden into town for grain and had returned with his silence wrapped around him like a burial shroud. The change in him was palpable. The fragile peace of the night before had been burned away, replaced by a coiled, angry tension. He sat at the table while Eliza served the simple meal she'd prepared, a stew made from smoked ham and beans. He stared into his plate, his jaw tight. She knew. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the smirks and the sideways glances. The whispers had given her a new name. She was no longer just the widow Miller. She was Cole's found property, a thing to be kept or discarded. She was the crippled freeloader, a parasite clinging to a good man's misplaced pity. The words were designed to strip her of her humanity, to reduce her to her injury and her dependency. She sat opposite him, the stew tasting like ash in her mouth. The silence in the room was no longer comfortable. It was jagged and raw. He picked up his coffee mug. It was a thick, earthenware thing, old and stained. His hand, which had been so steady while mending the leather, trembled with a barely contained rage. He gripped the mug, his knuckles turning white. His anger was a living thing in the room, a wild animal pacing in a cage too small for it. He was angry at the town, at their vile tongues, at the injustice of it all. And he was angry at himself for being unable to protect this small, fragile piece they had found. With a sharp crack, the mug split in his hand. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet room. The mug broke cleanly in two, spilling hot, dark coffee across the table and onto his hand. He didn't flinch. He just sat there, staring at the two broken halves in his palm, a thin line of red welling up where a sharp edge had cut him. Eliza's heart lurched. She saw the rage, the frustration, the pain etched on his face. She saw the storm that was breaking inside of him, and in that moment, she felt a profound and aching tenderness for this man who felt things so deeply he could break stone with his bare hands. She rose slowly, took a cloth from the dry sink, and dipped it in the water bucket. She walked over to him and gently, without a word, took his hand. She carefully pried the broken pieces of the mug from his grasp and set them aside. Then, with the damp cloth, she began to clean the coffee and the blood from his skin. He let her, his hand lying limp in hers, his breathing ragged. She looked at his face, at the storm in his dark eyes. "They always talk," she said softly. It was not an excuse. It was not a comfort. It was a statement of fact, as simple and as unchangeable as the setting of the sun. It was the foundational truth of her life, a truth she had learned to live with long ago. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of 1,000 other whispers, 1,000 other sneers. She was telling him that this world they inhabited, the one of scorn and cruel words, was her home, and his anger, however righteous, could not burn it down. The fragile peace born in the storm could not survive the light of day. It was a delicate thing, like a web spun in the dark, and the first touch of the outside world tore it to shreds. In the days that followed, the silence in the small house returned, but it was different. It was no longer a space of mutual respect. It was a chasm of unspoken resentments. Cole's anger, which had shattered the coffee mug, did not dissipate. It settled deep inside him, a low, simmering fire that made his jaw tight and his movements rigid. He worked from before dawn until after dusk, mending fences, clearing brush, losing himself in the physical exhaustion of labor as if trying to outrun the whispers that had followed him home from town. Eliza felt the change in him as a constant, low-grade fever in the house. The tentative connection they had forged by the fireside was gone, replaced by a careful, painful distance. He avoided her eyes. His words, already sparse, were now reduced to the barest necessities of cohabitation. He had pulled her from the dust. Yes, but now the dust of the town's opinion was settling on them both, and he did not know how to brush it away. She, in turn, retreated into herself. The shame of being the source of his trouble was a heavy cloak. She cooked and cleaned with a feverish, silent efficiency, trying to make herself useful, to make her presence weigh less. But every scrubbed pot, every mended shirt, felt like an apology he didn't want to hear. She was a debt he could not pay off, and her very existence was a constant, nagging reminder of it. The pantry began to empty. The flour sack, once plump and promising, was now a sad, limp thing. The beans were low. The salt pork was gone. Necessity, sharp and insistent, finally forced their hand. "I need to go to town," she said one morning, her voice small in the tense quiet of the kitchen. "For flour." Cole stopped, a piece of bacon halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, and for the first time in days, his eyes were not guarded but filled with a raw, protective anger. "No," he said. The word was a flat, hard stone. "We have no flour," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I can't make bread. There's nothing left." "I'll go." "And what will they say then?" she challenged softly. "That you're doing my marketing for me, that I'm so useless I can't even fetch my own supplies. It will only make it worse. For both of us." He knew she was right. His going would be an admission of her fragility, a confirmation of the town's narrative. He put the bacon down, his appetite gone. The muscle in his jaw worked. He was trapped. To keep her here was to starve. To let her go was to send her back to the wolves. He said nothing else, but when she was ready to leave, her old, oversized coat wrapped around her, her crutch in hand, he was standing by the door. He pressed a small, heavy coin into her palm and closed her fingers around it. It was not a gift. It was a piece of armor. It was his trust, his reluctant permission. "Get what you need," he said, and turned away before she could see the conflict in his face. The walk to redemption was a crucifixion. Every step was a fresh wound. The sun was high and merciless, beating down on her head. The dust kicked up by her crutch, and her dragging foot coated her dress, her skin, her lips. She was no longer the desperate refugee fleeing the town. She was a supplicant, forced to return to her tormentors, coin in hand. The town was just as she remembered it, but her perception of it had sharpened. Every window looked like a watching eye. Every closed door felt like a judgment. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, focusing on her destination, the mercantile, a place of public transaction where, she hoped, the simple act of commerce might shield her from comment. She was wrong. She pushed open the heavy door, a small bell announcing her arrival. The store was a dim, cool cavern smelling of pickles, leather, and bolts of calico, and it was not empty. At the far end of the counter, examining a length of ribbon, stood two women, Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, and Mrs. Hemlock, the blacksmith's. They were the twin pillars of the town's moral authority, their righteousness as starched and unforgiving as their high-necked blouses. They heard the bell. They turned. Their eyes fell upon Eliza, and an identical expression of distaste tightened their mouths. As if by a silent, prearranged signal, they both took a small, deliberate step away from her, gathering their skirts close to their bodies as if to prevent them from being contaminated by her presence. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She ignored them, her face a mask of pained neutrality. She hobbled to the counter. "A sack of flour, please, Mr. Henderson," she said to the proprietor, her voice tight. Mr. Henderson, a man whose spine was as malleable as his prices, gave her a nervous, fleeting smile and scurried off to the storeroom. Eliza was left alone in the charged silence, acutely aware of the two women behind her. Then the whispering began. It was not a true whisper. It was a stage whisper, pitched just loud enough to carry, sharp and pointed as a sewing needle. "Well, look what the wind blew in." "Mrs." Hemlock murmured to her companion. "I suppose even charity cases have to eat." "It's not charity she's living on now." "Mrs." Gable replied, her voice dripping with sanctimony. It's a man's pity. I do wonder if his pity buys her loyalty. The question was a polished stone, thrown with perfect aim. It struck Eliza squarely in the back. Pity, loyalty, a transaction. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hand gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles were white. Do not react. Do not let them see. Mrs. Hemlock let out a small, cruel titter. Loyalty. What good is the loyalty of a broken thing? She's nothing but a walking shadow on a crutch. A walking shadow on a crutch. The words were a physical blow. They hollowed her out, leaving her empty and echoing with their truth. She was a shadow. She was a ghost haunting Cole's house, a constant reminder of the brother he had lost. She was a collection of broken parts, held together by another's guilt. Mr. Henderson returned, hefting a small sack of flour onto the counter. That'll be, he began, but Eliza didn't hear him. She fumbled with the coin Cole had given her, her fingers suddenly numb and clumsy. She dropped it on the counter with a clatter, pushed it toward the storekeeper, and grabbed the sack. She did not wait for change. She could not bear another second in that suffocating space. She turned and fled. Her escape was not a walk, but a panicked, lurching run. Her crutch struck the floorboards with desperate, uneven thuds. The whispers followed her, sharp and triumphant. She pushed the door open and burst out into the blinding, indifferent sunlight. She ran, heedless of the stares of the men on the saloon porch. Her only thought was to get away, to put the town and its venom behind her. She was halfway down the main street when her desperation outpaced her coordination. The tip of her crutch caught on a loose board. Her balance, always a precarious thing, was gone in an instant. She stumbled forward, her arms pinwheeling. The sack of flour, her reason for this entire humiliating ordeal, flew from her grasp. It hit the ground with a soft, dull thud and split open. A great white cloud erupted in the street. Flour billowed into the air, a ghostly plume that settled on her dark dress, on her hair, on the dusty ground. It was a puff of pure, white shame, a public announcement of her failure. For a moment, the world was silent, and she was frozen in the center of her own white disaster. Then she heard a low, rolling wave of laughter from the saloon porch. That broke her. A sob, hot and ragged, tore from her throat. She abandoned the ruined flour, the empty basket, and ran. She ran with a desperate, hobbling gait, her face burning, tears blurring the hard-packed street into a watery smear. She didn't stop until she saw the leaning fence posts of Cole's property. The gate was a finish line, a sanctuary. But he was there. He stood just inside the gate, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud. He had been watching for her. He had seen her flight. He waited until she was just a few feet away, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, tears streaming down her flour-dusted face. He blocked her path. "Who did this to you?" he demanded. His voice was a low, dangerous growl. He was looking for a name, a target for the fury that was coiling in his gut. He wanted an enemy he could fight, a man he could hit. Eliza shook her head, wiping at her tears with the back of a shaky hand, smearing the white flour into a pasty mess. "No one," she choked out. "Don't lie to me. Eliza, who made you cry?" She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a pain that went deeper than any simple insult. "No one did," she repeated, her voice gaining a strange, brittle strength. It was their truth. He stared at her, uncomprehending. Their truth. What poison were they feeding you? That I'm a burden, that I'm a broken thing you took in out of pity. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. His face hardened. He took a step closer, his hands unclenching from his arms. "You are not a burden to me." He said it like a vow, a declaration of war against the town and its whispers. It was meant to be a comfort, a shield. But the shield glanced off the real wound. He didn't understand. His protection was not what she needed. She needed a definition. She needed to know her place in his world was not defined by his charity. "Then what am I?" The question was quiet, but it sliced through the air between them, sharp as a shard of glass. It hung there, demanding an answer he did not have. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at her, at this wreck of a woman covered in flour and tears, and his own inadequacy rose up to choke him. He saw her as strong, as a survivor. He saw her as the person who had brought light back into his dead house, but he had never said it. He didn't have the words for it. Her silence was his answer, and in that silence, she finally understood. She saw it all with a devastating, heartbreaking clarity. She was not a partner. She was not a companion. She was a project. She was a penance. A strange calm settled over her. The tears stopped. Her voice, when she spoke, was devoid of heat or anger. It was the voice of a judge delivering a final, irrevocable sentence. "I know what I am," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I'm the ghost you pulled from the dust because you couldn't pull your brother out of it." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. He actually recoiled, a sharp intake of breath the only sound he made. The anger drained from his face, leaving it pale and shocked. He looked as if she had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. The air grew thin, stretched taut between them like a fiddle string, vibrating with the terrible, unspoken truth she had just given voice to. Jacob. It had always been about Jacob. He stood there, mute and shattered. He was a man of fences and hammers, of horses and earth. He could face a storm, a drought, a wild animal, but he could not face this. He could not face the truth of his own heart laid bare. He started, his voice a rough, strangled rasp. "I'm not good with words." It was the most profound confession he had ever made, an admission of his own crippling emotional illiteracy. Eliza looked at him, at this strong, broken man, and a wave of despair and a desperate, defiant hope washed through her. She had cut him open with the truth. Now, she would see what was inside. "Then do something real," she pleaded, her voice cracking. It was not a request. It was a dare, a prayer. "Don't speak. Act. Show me what I am to you. Show me I'm more than a shadow. Do something real, or let me go." The challenge hung in the air between them, sharp and fragile as an icicle. Do something real. It was a demand that stripped away all his defenses. He was a man of action, but his actions had always been directed at the physical world, a stubborn mule, a broken fence, the unyielding earth. He had no tools for this. He had no language for the raw, aching space that her words had torn open inside him. He looked down at his own hands. They were large, calloused, scarred from a lifetime of hard labor. They could soothe a spooked horse, set a fence post straight and true, and break a man's jaw. But they were clumsy, useless things in the face of her pain. He opened one hand and then clenched it into a fist, a gesture of profound, agonizing helplessness. What real thing could he do to answer the truth she had thrown at his feet? He could not deny her words. The ghost of Jacob was always there, a cold shadow at the edge of his vision. When he had seen her in the street, kneeling in the dust, a part of him had seen his brother, bleeding in that same dust, alone. His act of helping her had been tangled up in his own failure, his own grief. He had thought it was a simple, private penance. He had not realized it had a cost for her, too. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, and in the fading light, he saw the flour still dusting her hair like a premature graying, the tear tracks on her cheeks, and the fierce, desperate dignity in her gaze. She was not a ghost. She was flesh and blood and pain, and she was demanding to be seen as more than a symbol of his sorrow. His voice, when it came, was a low, rough sound, like stones grinding together. It was the sound of a word being pulled up from a place that had been sealed off for a very long time. "You," he began, then stopped, the word catching in his throat. He swallowed hard and started again. "You make me remember what mercy looks like." It was a confession. Not an answer to her question, but something deeper. It was the truest thing he could offer. For a year, his world had been governed by the hard, unforgiving laws of grief and anger. He had forgotten the shape of kindness. He had forgotten that a hand could be extended for a reason other than to strike or to take. She, with her quiet resilience and her heartbreaking sorrow, had reminded him of a language he thought he had forgotten. The fierce light in Eliza's eyes softened. The fight seemed to drain out of her, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. She looked away from him, toward the long, empty road leading back to town. "Mercy is a dangerous thing, Mr. Reyes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It makes people want more than they're entitled to." She was speaking of herself. She was warning him that his small act of compassion had planted a seed of hope in her, and hope was a perilous crop to grow in such barren soil. Once you have been given a drink of water, you begin to dream of a well. Once you have been shown a moment of mercy, you begin to crave a life without cruelty. Cole took a half-step closer to her, the space between them shrinking. The raw, shocked look on his face had been replaced by a quiet, somber intensity. He had lived his life by a simple, brutal calculus of what a man earns, what a man takes, and what a man is owed. Her words forced him to look at a different kind of ledger. "Maybe you deserve it," he said. The words fell into the quiet evening air like stones dropped into a deep well. They were not a promise. They were not a declaration. They were a possibility. Spoken aloud for the first time, maybe you deserve more. Maybe you deserve a home. Maybe you deserve to be more than a walking shadow. It was a quiet, revolutionary thought, and saying it felt like a kind of treason against the grief that had been his only loyal companion for so long. It felt like a confession of a crime he hadn't yet committed but was now considering. He bent down and picked up her fallen basket. He did not look at the ruined flower, a white scar on the dark earth. He simply held the basket in his hands, a useless, empty thing, and looked at her. The confrontation was over. There was nothing more to say. The truth had been spoken, and now they had to find a way to live with it. Later that night, a soft rain began to fall. It was not the violent, angry downpour of the storm they had weathered before, but a gentle, whispering shower that beaded on the window panes and pattered a soft, steady rhythm on the roof. It was a cleansing rain, washing the dust from the air and the flour from the street. They sat on the porch, not in the chairs, but on the top step, as if they were both too weary to settle into comfort. They sat side by side, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, but not touching. A respectable, careful distance remained between them, a silence that was no longer angry or awkward, but pensive and deep. The darkness of the prairie was absolute, broken only by the square of yellow light spilling from the open doorway behind them. Eliza pulled the old wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. She stared out into the blackness, listening to the rain. "They'll call me worse things now," she said into the dark. It was a simple statement of fact. A woman living in a man's house, unchaperoned, unmarried. The whispers about pity would curdle into something much uglier. Cole did not flinch from the truth of her words. He looked at the fence line he had spent the last few days mending. The new cedar rails were pale against the older, weathered wood. A clear line of repair. He had built that fence to mark his property, to keep his livestock in and the wild things out. It was a boundary, a line of defense. "I'll stand between you and them," he said. His voice was quiet, but held the solid, unshakable certainty of a stone foundation. It was the most real thing he could offer. He was not promising to change their minds. He was not promising that the whispers would stop. He was promising that they would have to go through him to get to her. He was offering to be a human fence, a barrier built not to imprison her, but to protect the small, fragile space they were beginning to build. A long, trembling sigh escaped Eliza's lips. It was the sound of a burden being set down, a weight she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. "I don't know how I can ever repay you," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. She was still thinking in the language of transactions, of debts and payments, because it was the only language she had been taught. "Gratitude isn't for sale," he replied, his voice rough. He was dismissing the very idea of debt between them. What he was offering wasn't something that could be bought or sold or earned. It was something freely given. He was, in his own spare, awkward way, rewriting the rules of their world. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The only sounds, the soft drumming of the rain and the distant, lonely call of a night bird. The air felt different. The unspoken truth of Jacob's ghost was still there, but it was no longer a chasm between them. It was a shared sorrow, a foundation of acknowledged pain on which something new might be built. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Eliza did something impossibly brave. She lifted her hand and reached across the small distance that separated them. She gently laid her fingers on the back of his hand, where it rested on his knee. Her touch was light as a moth's wing. Her skin was cool and soft against his rough, calloused knuckles. It was a simple, profound gesture, an acceptance, a question, an answer. Cole froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. His first instinct, born of a year of solitude and grief, was to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of his own pain. But he didn't. He sat perfectly still, the light touch of her fingers a brand on his skin. He did not flinch. He did not recoil. He let her touch him, and in his stillness, he gave his consent. He accepted the bridge she was building across the silence. Something passed between them in that moment, in the quiet dark of the porch, with the rain whispering around them. It was not a promise. It was not a vow. It was something far more fragile and far more real. It was the first, quiet sacrament of peace, a truce with the past, a silent agreement to face the future. It was the first, tentative seed of a feeling that neither of them dared to name, the feeling of being, finally, home. The morning broke, crystalline and sharp. The rain had washed the world clean, leaving behind the rich, dark scent of damp earth and the clean perfume of wet cedar. For the first time, the air didn't taste of dust. It was a morning for new beginnings, a morning that held the fragile promise of peace. The touch on the porch the night before had changed the texture of the silence between them. It was no longer a space of caution, but one of profound, terrifying possibility. They ate breakfast without speaking, but it was a shared silence, the kind that exists between two people who have weathered the same storm and are now assessing the damage in the clear light of day. Eliza moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, as if her limbs were made of glass. She washed the 2 tin plates, placing them on the shelf with a soft click that seemed to echo in the still room. She stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the clean, bright world, her back to him. Cole watched her, a knot tightening in his chest. He saw the way the morning light caught the fine hairs at the nape of her neck, the resolute stillness of her shoulders. She was gathering herself, building a wall he could not see but could feel as surely as the wooden planks beneath his feet. She turned from the window, her face calm and composed, but her eyes held the deep, weary sadness of a traveler who knows the road ahead is long and hard. "I should go," she said. The 4 words were spoken so softly, they were almost absorbed by the quiet of the room, but they landed on Cole with the force of a hammer blow. He had been expecting them, dreading them, since the moment he'd seen her standing in the ruin of the flower in the street, and yet they still managed to knock the wind out of him. He kept his voice level, betraying none of the sudden, cold panic that gripped him. "Go where?" The question was a challenge, a demand for a logic that he knew this decision did not possess. She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on some point beyond him, beyond the walls of this house. Somewhere people stare less, It was a simple, devastating answer. She was not running from him. She was running from the world, a world that would never let them be. She was choosing a different kind of loneliness over the public shame of their current arrangement. A surge of hot, protective anger rose in him. "Who says you're my shame?" he asked, his voice low and tight. It was the town he was angry at, the petty, cruel whispers. But the question was for her. He needed her to know that their judgment held no power over him. Finally, she met his eyes, and what he saw there was not accusation, but a deep, sorrowful truth. "Your distance says it," she replied. The words were a clean, sharp cut, straight to the bone. It wasn't about the town. It wasn't about Mrs. Gable or the men on the saloon porch. It was about him, about the careful, calculated space he kept between them, the way he avoided her gaze after a moment of shared understanding, the way he filled the house with the noise of his work to avoid the sound of their shared silence. He was a fortress, and he had offered her shelter in the courtyard, but had never once unlocked the door to the keep. He felt the blood drain from his face. He had no defense against the truth. "I was just giving you a place to heal," he said, the words sounding weak and hollow even to his own ears. It was a justification, not a reason, a poor excuse for his own cowardice. She gave a small, sad smile that did not reach her eyes. "A room can also be a goodbye," she said, "a place to rest before you continue the journey." She had seen his kindness for what it was: temporary. A way station, not a home. The conversation was over. There was nothing left to say. He had built his walls too high, and now she was choosing to walk away from them rather than try to scale them. She spent the rest of the day packing. It was a quiet, methodical process that tore him apart from the inside out. He went outside, telling himself he had work to do, but he could not concentrate. He found himself standing by the woodpile, axe in hand, listening to the sounds of her departure. There was not much to pack. Her worldly possessions fit into a single, small bundle. He heard the faint rustle of her one good dress being folded, the one she had worn when she arrived, tattered and stained. She had washed it and mended it with thread pulled from a burlap sack, her stitches small and neat. Each careful fold of that worn fabric felt to Cole like a page being turned in a book he had just begun to read. He heard her soft, limping footsteps as she moved from the small bedroom to the main room. The floorboards creaked a soft, mournful protest, a sound he had grown accustomed to, a sound that meant she was here, that the house was not empty. Now it was the sound of her leaving. He tried to work. He picked up a piece of leather and an awl, but his hands were clumsy. The image of her face, calm and resolute, was burned into his mind. He had offered her a room, a roof, a meal. He had thought that was enough. He had thought that was what she needed. He had never considered that what she might need was him, not his protection, but his presence. The thought was so foreign, so terrifying, that he could barely breathe. To let someone in, truly in, was to give them the power to destroy you. He had sealed himself off after Jacob died, vowing to never feel that kind of loss again. Every small sound from the house was a new torment. The soft clink of a jar as she gathered the few herbs she had found and dried. The gentle scrape of a box on the floor. Each noise was an act of erasure. She was systematically removing every trace of herself from his home, and with each trace that vanished, Cole felt a piece of himself being carved away. The clean kitchen, the mended tack, the faint scent of soap and warm bread that had finally chased away the stale smell of grief. It was all being packed away with her meager belongings. He was losing something he hadn't even known he'd found. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The day was ending. Her time was running out. His time was running out. He saw her emerge from the house as the light turned the color of old brass. She wore the oversized man's coat. Her small bundle was in one hand, her crutch in the other. She pulled the door shut behind her, the sound a soft, final click. She did not look toward him. She began to walk toward the gate, toward the road that led back to redemption and then away, to nowhere. He could not let her go like this. He dropped the piece of leather he was mangling and walked to intercept her, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He met her halfway between the house and the gate. She stopped, her face in the shadow of the dying light. She looked up at him, and her expression was one of immense, heartbreaking gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady. "For the room, for the food, for making me feel human again." The simple, honest sincerity of her words was more painful than any accusation. She was thanking him for the crumbs he had offered her, while she was starving for a place at the table. He felt something inside him break, the carefully constructed wall of his grief, the fortress of his solitude. It all just cracked and gave way. "You talk like someone who's already dead," he said, his voice a harsh, ragged whisper. He was not angry at her. He was terrified for her. He saw her walking away into a world that would chew her up and spit her out, and she was doing it with a polite, grateful smile. She looked out at the vast, darkening prairie, at the endless expanse of nothing that awaited her. "Maybe I'm just walking slowly," she replied. It was not a statement of defeat. It was an acceptance of her fate. She was not giving up. She was simply enduring, one painful step at a time, toward an end she could not see but knew was inevitable. That was it. That was the moment he knew he could not let her go. He could not stand by and watch her walk slowly into oblivion. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stood directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to see his face. He was a wall, a barrier between her and the road. She could feel the heat of him, the barely controlled tremor of emotion running through him. "You're not going anywhere," he said. The words were not a command. They were a raw, desperate plea. Her eyes widened, a flicker of confusion, of a hope she did not dare to feel. In their depths. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to hold on to the words he was about to say. His hands were fists at his sides. "You're not going," he repeated, his voice thick, breaking on the words. "Because when I look at you, when I see you fighting for every single step, for every breath, I see that I shouldn't have given up." His confession hung in the twilight air, raw and exposed. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about him. She was not his penance for Jacob. She was his reason. The reason to stop living like a ghost in his own house. The reason to tear down the walls and face the world again. She, in her brokenness, had shown him the way back to being whole. She was his cure, and he had almost let her walk away. His words were not a kindness. They were a confession, and they landed in the quiet air with the weight of a fallen tree. Eliza stared at him, her own carefully constructed resolve beginning to fracture. She had spent the day preparing for a lonely road, accepting it as her due. She had understood her role in his life as that of a ghost, a stand-in for a memory. But the man before her was not looking at a ghost. He was looking at her, and his eyes were raw with a truth she had never allowed herself to imagine. The practicality that had been her shield for so long rose up, a last, desperate defense against a hope that felt too dangerous to hold. "Don't say that," she whispered, her voice a thin, brittle thing. She was not rejecting his words. She was trying to save him from them. "You'll regret it, when the town laughs, when they point and whisper. You'll wish you had let me walk away." She was offering him an escape, a chance to take back the words that would surely chain him to her limp, to her tarnished name. A profound change came over Cole's face. The raw vulnerability of his confession hardened into something else, something solid and unshakable as granite. He had spent a year letting the town's opinion fester inside him, a quiet poison. But now, it seemed, he had found the antidote. "Let him," he said. The words were quiet, but they held the force of a slammed door. There was no anger in them, only a deep, profound indifference to the world beyond his fence line. He had made his choice. The opinions of others were nothing but wind, and he would no longer let them dictate the direction of his life. Her first line of defense had crumbled. She fell back to her second, the one that was more deeply ingrained, the one that had defined her for years, her own fragility. "What if I fall again?" she asked. The question a stark admission of her deepest fear. It was not just about her leg. It was about her spirit. What if she stumbled? What if she failed? What if she proved to be everything the town already believed she was? She was asking him if he was truly prepared for the reality of her brokenness. He didn't hesitate. His dark eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw not pity, but a fierce, unwavering promise. "Then I will catch you before you hit the ground," he said. It was not a boast. It was a simple statement of intent, as practical and as solid as a newly driven fence post. He was telling her that her falling was not something to be feared, but simply a thing that would be dealt with. He would be there, always. The certainty in his voice chipped away at the last of her walls. The fear for him was gone. The fear of herself was quieted. All that was left was the core truth of her existence, the name she had given herself. "I don't want to be a burden," she said, the words a final, exhausted plea. It was the identity she could not escape, the freeloader, the charity case, the weight on another's soul. He took the final step that closed the distance between them. He stood so close she could feel the heat of his body, smell the scent of wood smoke and damp earth that clung to him. He looked down at her, and his face was stripped of all its harshness, all its grief. All that remained was a stark, breathtaking intensity. "Eliza," he said, and the sound of her own name in his mouth was a revelation. He had never used it before. "You are not the burden." He paused, his gaze searching her face, willing her to understand the words that came next. "You are the reason." The world stopped. The wind died. The last of the bird song fell silent. The words hung in the air, vibrating with a power that went beyond sound. "You are the reason. A reason to fight. A reason to live. A reason to stop being a ghost in his own life." It was not a declaration of love, not in the way the poets wrote about. It was something more elemental, more fundamental. It was a statement of purpose. It was the answer to a question he hadn't even known he was asking. A storm broke between them, but it had no thunder, no lightning. It was a silent, brilliant maelstrom of understanding, a blinding flash of connection that arced across the small space separating them, fusing two solitary souls into something new and whole. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the whispers and the shame were burned away in that incandescent moment of pure, unvarnished truth. Eliza felt the strength go out of her good leg. She sagged against her crutch, her breath catching in her throat. She had been defined by what she was not whole, not worthy, not wanted. In a single sentence, he had given her a new definition. He had named her. She looked down, overwhelmed, unable to bear the intensity in his eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with an emotion she could not name. She retreated to the only thing that felt solid, the only thing she knew how to offer. "If I stay," she began, her voice gaining a small measure of strength as she clung to the familiar territory of practicality. "I will work, I will cook, and clean the floors, and keep the fire. I will earn my place." She was trying to build a new contract, one based on labor, a framework she could understand. He reached out then, not to touch her, but he lifted his hand as if to gently stop the words. "It is not about the work anymore," he said softly. He was letting her know that the old terms no longer applied. Their relationship had shifted from a transaction of shelter for service into something else entirely. He lowered his hand, his meaning clear. "It's about the heart." It was the final key, the one that unlocked the last rusted door inside her. She had offered him her hands, And he had asked for her heart. It was the one thing she had thought was worthless, a broken and useless thing. And he was telling her it was the only thing that mattered. A single tear, hot and cleansing, escaped her eye and traced a path through the flower dust on her cheek. She looked up at him, her entire, wounded, hopeful soul in her gaze. "Then," she whispered, the word a fragile breath of surrender, "I'll stay." It was done. The decision was made. The road she had been preparing to walk alone had vanished. A new path, one she had never dared to imagine, lay before her. Cole let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound and weary relief. The tension that had held him rigid for what felt like an eternity seemed to drain out of him. He stepped back, just an inch, giving her space to breathe. He looked at her, not with the fierce intensity of before, but with a look of quiet wonder, as if he were seeing a miracle he was half afraid he had imagined. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if a sudden movement might shatter the fragile, perfect reality they had just created. He was afraid to frighten the dream away. They stood there for a long moment as the last of the light bled from the sky, and the first, shy stars began to prick the deep velvet of the night. There were no more words. None were needed. The most important things had been said. He turned and walked back to the house, his steps slow and measured. She followed. Inside, the fire he had banked before coming out to find her was now a bed of glowing, welcoming embers. He added a log, and the flames leaped up, filling the small room with a warm, dancing light. He went to the shelf and took down 2 tin mugs. He filled the coffee pot with fresh water and set it on the stove to heat. They moved around the small kitchen in a new kind of silence, a comfortable, easy rhythm that felt as if it had existed for years. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 steaming cups and handed one to her. She took it, their fingers brushing for a fleeting, electric second. They didn't speak. They walked back out onto the porch and sat on the top step, just as they had the night before. But this time, they sat a little closer. The careful distance was gone. Their shoulders were almost touching. They drank their coffee, staring out at the vast, dark prairie, which no longer seemed empty and menacing, but peaceful and full of promise. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and the wood smoke curling from their own chimney. Down by the steps, his heavy, mud-caked work boots stood where he had kicked them off. Beside them, small and worn, was the single, scuffed boot she wore on her good foot. 2 pairs of boots, side by side, at rest, ready for a new day, and a new road they would walk together. The weeks that followed were a quiet alchemy, transforming the raw elements of their shared lives into something solid and precious. The town of Redemption did not change its heart overnight, but the nature of its whispers shifted. The initial, sharp-edged gossip, fueled by scandal and malice, began to dull with the simple, undeniable reality of Cole and Eliza's continued existence. They became a fact, a feature of the landscape, and the town, like a grudging river, slowly began to flow around them. When they went to the mercantile for supplies, they walked side by side. Cole no longer walked ahead, a silent protector, and Eliza no longer followed, a hesitant shadow. They walked together, a single, unified front. They did not bow their heads. They met the sideways glances of Mrs. Gable and the cold stares of the men on the saloon porch with a quiet, unblinking dignity. They asked for what they needed, paid their coin, and left. Their silence was its own statement, more powerful than any argument. It said, "This is our life. We are not ashamed." And the whispers, though they never vanished entirely, lost their power. They became what they had always been, empty noise, a bitter wind blowing against a house with a strong foundation. Life on the homestead settled into a rhythm, as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. It was a language spoken not in words, but in shared tasks and quiet gestures. It was the sound of his axe splitting wood in the crisp morning air, answered by the scent of her coffee brewing on the stove. It was the sight of a shirt she had mended, laid neatly on his chair, answered by a bucket of fresh, cold water he had drawn for her, left just inside the door. Behind the house, in a small patch of earth that had lain fallow for years, a garden began to grow. Cole had tilled the hard-packed soil, his shovel breaking the ground that had been sealed by grief. Eliza, kneeling on a piece of burlap sacking, had planted the seeds beans, squash, and corn, and now, in the dark, rich earth, the first miraculous signs of life were pushing through. Tiny green shoots, tender but tenacious, uncurling toward the sun. Cole found reasons to be near that garden. He would spend an entire afternoon fixing a single perfectly sturdy fence post that bordered the patch of tilled earth. He would hammer a nail, then pause, leaning on the post as he watched Eliza move between the rows with a watering can. He watched the careful, gentle way she tended to the fragile seedlings, her touch as soft as the evening light. He watched the way the sun caught in her hair, turning it the color of spun gold. He watched the small, private smile that touched her lips as she saw a new sprout breaking through the soil. And in those long, quiet moments, leaning on a fence that needed no mending, Cole Reyes felt a sense of peace so profound it almost hurt. He was guarding this new life, this small, green, hopeful thing, and the woman who was making it grow. One afternoon, a horse and buggy rattled up the track to the house. It was Reverend Miller, the town preacher. He was a tall, somber man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of mild disapproval. He had come, he said, to check on the welfare of a former member of his flock. Eliza served him coffee on the porch, her movements calm and poised. Cole stood by the porch rail, his silence a formidable presence. The Reverend made small talk, his eyes darting around, taking in the mended fence, the neat woodpile, the clean-swept porch. He was assessing, judging. Finally, he set his cup down and cleared his throat, getting to the true purpose of his visit. He looked directly at Cole, his gaze stern. "Mr. Reyes," he began, his voice taking on the sonorous tone he used in the pulpit. "The good book speaks of charity and of offering succor to those in need, but it also speaks of propriety, of doing things in a way that is right and honorable in the eyes of God and the community." Cole did not stir. He just met the preacher's gaze, his own eyes dark and unreadable. "If you mean to keep her here," the Reverend continued, his meaning clear, "then you must do right by her." It was a command cloaked in clerical concern, an ultimatum from the town's moral arbiter. Make it proper, make it respectable, marry her. Cole looked over at Eliza. She was staring down into her lap, her hands clasped tightly together. He saw the faint blush on her cheeks, the slight tremor in her hands. He turned his gaze back to the preacher. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "I mean to," Cole said. The words were quiet, but they held the weight of an oath sworn on a stack of Bibles. It was not a concession to the Reverend or the town. It was a simple, solid statement of a truth he had already come to know in his own heart. The Reverend, taken aback by the directness of the reply, could only nod. He finished his coffee, offered a brief, formal prayer for their household, and left, his mission accomplished. That evening, the air was heavy with the unspoken. The preacher's visit had brought the future into the room, a tangible presence that sat with them at the dinner table. Later, as a low bank of clouds gathered, bringing with it a cool breeze that smelled of rain, Eliza was folding the laundry she had brought in from the line. She picked up one of Cole's chambray work shirts. It was still faintly damp, and it smelled of sun and wind. She folded it carefully, her hands smoothing the worn fabric. She stood with the folded shirt held against her chest, her back to him. "The Reverend," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He was right to say what he did. She paused, gathering her courage. You "You do not have to do anything you do not wish to do. You have already done more for me than I could have ever hoped for." She was giving him an escape, a final chance to change his mind, to say that his words to the preacher had just been a way to placate him. Cole, who was cleaning a piece of tack by the firelight, set his work down. He looked at her small, straight back, at the way she clutched his shirt like a shield. He had spent his life doing things because they were necessary, mending fences, breaking horses, surviving. He had never before been faced with a choice that was about what he wanted, and the clarity of it, the simple, overwhelming truth of it, was astonishing. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and certain, "there is nothing in this world I want to do more right than this." She stood frozen for a moment, then gave a small, shaky nod, and carried the folded laundry into the bedroom. The next morning, when Eliza came into the kitchen, the early light was just beginning to spill through the clean window. The room was quiet and still, and on the center of the scrubbed wooden table, sitting side by side in a small patch of sunlight, were 2 rings. They were not made of gold or silver. They were simple, humble bands, forged from a horseshoe nail, heated in his forge and hammered into shape by his own hand. They were rough and imperfect, bearing the faint marks of the hammer, but they were solid. They were strong, and they shone in the morning light with a beauty that no jeweler's bauble could ever possess. They were a promise, made of iron and fire and will. The wedding was not a public affair. It was a quiet ceremony held in the Reverend Miller's study, with the blacksmith and his wife, Mrs. Hemlock, her face a mask of grudging acceptance, as the only witnesses. Eliza wore her one good dress, mended and clean. Cole wore a shirt she had washed and ironed for him. They spoke the simple, ancient words that bound their lives together, their voices quiet but steady in the still, dusty room. And when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Cole slipped the rough iron ring onto her finger. It was cool and solid, a tangible anchor in the shifting currents of her life. They walked out of the church and back to the homestead, man and wife, the whispers of the town now nothing more than the rustling of dry leaves. That night, Eliza made a special meal, a small chicken roasted with herbs from her garden, and a pan of cornbread that filled the small house with a warm, comforting aroma. The fire crackled in the hearth, and a single lantern on the table cast a gentle, golden glow. As she was taking the last of the dishes from the table, a sudden shyness, a sweet, terrifying vulnerability, overcame her. She stood by the table, her new ring a comforting weight on her finger, and looked at the man who was now her husband. She started, her cheeks flushing a deep, rosy red. "I should tell you, I don't know how to dance." It was a confession of a small, frivolous lack, but it felt immense, a confession of all the joy and lightness that her hard life had never allowed her. Cole looked at her, his expression soft in the lantern light. A slow, rare smile touched his lips, a smile that reached all the way to his dark, gentle eyes. He pushed his chair back and stood up. "Neither do I," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He took a step toward her. "I don't dance." He paused, his smile widening. "I cook." She looked at him, confused, a small, questioning frown on her face. He closed the small distance between them, and gently, hesitantly, as if he were handling the most fragile glass, he placed his large, warm hand on the small of her back. His touch was a steady, solid presence, an anchor. "So," he said softly, his eyes holding hers, "we'll waltz in the kitchen." And he began to sway, a slow, simple, side-to-side rhythm leading her with him. Her body, so often a source of pain and awkwardness, followed his lead, her limp seeming to soften and dissolve into the gentle motion. They swayed together in the warm, fragrant heart of their home. There was no music, only the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth and the gentle hiss of the lantern. The only rhythm was the steady, quiet beat of their two hearts, finally at rest. Outside, the prairie wind whispered around the corners of the house, telling its lonely, ancient stories to the stars. But inside, between the stove and the table, surrounded by the smell of cornbread and wood smoke, Cole and Eliza had found their own music, their own rhythm, their own perfect, quiet waltz. They were home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story be heard by more people, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.